Chapter 17. Rebecca has won. It was Maxim down on the terrace. I could not see him, but I could hear his voice. I heard Frith answer from the hall. "A ship's hit the rocks on the bay," Maxim called out. "The fog is terrible out there. Tell Mrs. Danvers to have food and drink ready for the men. I'm going back to the bay to see if I can do anything." Mrs. Danvers moved back from the window. "We had better go down," she said in her usual voice. "Frith will be looking for me. Be careful of your hands. I'm going to close the window." Then she went to the door and held it open for me. "When you see Mr. De Winter, madam, please tell him there will be a hot meal ready for the men at any time." I stared at her. "Yes," I said. "Yes, Mrs. Danvers." She turned her back on me and went along the corridor. I walked slowly out of the room. I felt as though I had just woken up from a long sleep. When I reached the hall, I saw Frith. "Did you hear the rockets, madam?" he said. "Mr. De Winter's gone down to the bay. He went across the lawn only a few minutes ago." I went out onto the terrace. The fog was beginning to clear and I could see the woods again. I looked up at the window above my head. It looked very high. I suddenly felt very hot. My head ached and my hands were wet. I stood very still. Then for the first time I realized that Maxim had not gone away. I had heard his voice, and he was down there in the bay. Maxim was safe. Nothing else mattered if Maxim was safe. I began to walk along the path through the woods. The fog had almost gone now. When I came to the bay, I could see the ship at once. She was on the rocks about 2 miles from the shore. There were some small boats near her. I climbed up the path to the cliffs above the bay. Frank was there talking to a coastguard, but I could not see Maxim. "They're going to send a diver down soon, Mrs. De Winter," said the coastguard. "They want to see if they can get the ship off the rocks." "Have you seen Maxim?" I asked Frank. "He's taken one of the sailors to hospital," Frank told me. "The man was hurt. Maxim is always a great help at times like this. What are you going to do? Can I walk back with you to the house?" "I think I'll stay here. I want to see the diver go down," I said. "Very well," Frank said. "I shall be at the office if you want me." The coastguard looked at his watch. "Well, I must be getting along too," he said. "Good afternoon." The sea was calm now. The diver went down and came up again. Nothing else happened. It was very hot. I sat on the cliffs for a long time doing nothing, thinking of nothing. When I looked at my watch again, it was 3 o'clock. I got up and walked down the hill to the bay. When I came to the other side, I saw Ben. He stood there, smiling at me. "Seen the big ship?" he said. "Yes," I said. "She's on the rocks, isn't she?" "She'll break up," he said. "The big ship won't go down like the little one. She won't come back, will she?" "Who?" I asked him. "Her," he said. "The other one." I did not know what Ben meant. I left him and walked towards the path through the woods. I did not look at the cottage. As I went up the path, a strange fear began to fill my heart. The house looked very peaceful. Mandalay was a place of safety and looked more beautiful than I had ever seen it. I felt for the first time that it was my home. I belonged to Mandalay, and Mandalay belonged to me. I went through the house and into the library. Jasper was not there. He must have gone out with Maxim. I suddenly felt very hungry, and so I asked Robert to bring in the tea. I still had a strange feeling of fear in my heart. I felt that I was waiting for something terrible. As I sat drinking my tea, Robert came back into the room. "Captain Searle, the harbour master's on the phone, madam," he told me. "He wants to come here and speak to Mr. De Winter at once. He said it's very important." Mr. De Winter's not back yet, Robert, I told him. Ask Captain Searle to come up and wait. Robert went out of the room with the message. I wondered what Captain Searle wanted to say. It must be something to do with the ship out in the bay. But why did he want to see Maxim? Captain Searle came into the library about 15 minutes later. He looked at me with his bright blue eyes. "I'm afraid I've got some bad news for Mr. De Winter. I don't know how to tell him." "What sort of news, Captain Searle?" I asked him.
"Well, Mrs. De Winter, it's not very pleasant. When we sent the diver down to look at the ship, he found something else. It was a little sailing boat. It's the boat that belonged to the late Mrs. De Winter."
"I'm sorry," I said. "Must you tell Mr. De Winter? Can't the boat be left there?"
"The man found something else," Captain Searle answered slowly. "The cabin door was closed, so he broke a window and looked in. Then he got a terrible fright. There was a body in there on the cabin floor. I must tell your husband, Mrs. De Winter. The police will have to know too."
This was the reason for the strange fear in my heart. Someone had been in the boat with Rebecca that night. "Do we have to tell him?" I asked.
"I've got to do my duty," Captain Searle said.
He stopped. The door had opened. It was Maxim.
"Hello," he said. "Is something the matter, Captain Searle?"
I felt very afraid. I went out of the room quickly and shut the door behind me. Jasper was in the hall and he walked out onto the terrace with me. I sat down. I must not fail Maxim now. I sat on the terrace until I heard Captain Searle's car drive away. Then I stood up and walked slowly back to the library. Maxim was standing by the window. I went and stood beside him. I took his hand and held it against my face. "I want to help you, Maxim," I said. "I've grown up, you know. I'm not a child anymore." Maxim put his arm around me and held me closely.
"I was angry with you last night, wasn't I?" he said.
"Maxim," I asked him, "can't we start again?"
"It's too late, my darling, too late," he said. "We've lost our chance of happiness. Something has happened. Something I've dreamt about night after night. I knew we could never be happy."
Maxim held both my hands and looked into my face.
"Rebecca has won," he said.
I stared at him. My heart began to beat fast. What was Maxim trying to tell me?
"I always knew this would happen," Maxim said. "Rebecca has kept us apart all this time. I remember how she looked at me before she died. I remember her smile. She knew this would happen. She knew she would win in the end."
"Maxim," I whispered, "what are you trying to tell me?" "Captain Searle told me about the boat. There was someone sailing with Rebecca. You have to find out who it was. That's it, isn't it, Maxim?"
"No," he said. "You don't understand. There was no one with Rebecca. She was alone."
I stood there watching his face, watching his eyes.
"It's Rebecca's body lying there on the cabin floor."
"No," I said. "No!"
"The woman buried in the church is not Rebecca. I always knew that," Maxim said. "Rebecca was not drowned. I killed her. I shot Rebecca in the cottage. I carried her body to the cabin, took the boat out that night and sank it. It's Rebecca who's lying there on the cabin floor. Will you look into my eyes and tell me that you love me now?"
Chapter 18. The Truth About Rebecca. It was very quiet in the library. When people have a great shock, they feel nothing at first. I stood beside Maxim and I had no feelings at all. Then Maxim took me in his arms and began to kiss me. I shut my eyes. He had never kissed me like this before. "I love you so much," he whispered. This is what I had wanted him to say every day and every night, but I could feel nothing now. Maxim stopped suddenly and pushed me away from him. "You see, I was right," he said. "It's too late. You don't love me now." "It's not too late," I said, putting my arms around him. "I love you more than anything in the world." "It's no use now," said Maxim. "We have no time. They've found the boat. They've found Rebecca." I stared at him, not understanding. "What will they do?" I said. "They will make sure that the body in the cabin is Rebecca. Then they will remember that other body in the church. The other woman. The one I said was Rebecca." "What are we going to do?" I said. Maxim did not answer. "Does anyone know? Anyone at all?" I said. Maxim shook his head. "Are you sure Frank doesn't know?" I asked quickly. "How could he?" said Maxim. "There was nobody there but me. It was dark." He stopped. He sat down on a chair and I went and knelt beside him. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered. "I nearly did once," Maxim said. "But you always seemed so unhappy and so shy." I answered very quietly. "I knew you were thinking about Rebecca all the time. How could I ask you to love me when I knew you loved Rebecca?" "You thought I loved Rebecca?" he said. "I hated her. We never loved each other. Rebecca never loved anyone except herself." I sat on the floor staring at him. "She was clever, of course," Maxim went on. "Everyone thought she was the kindest, the most charming person. When I married her, people told me I was the luckiest man in the world. I found out the truth 5 days after we were married. We were in the hills near Monte Carlo. It was the same place I went to with you, do you remember? She sat there in the car and told me terrible, evil things about herself. Things that I could not tell anyone." Maxim stared out of the window. "I did not kill her then," he said. "I let her laugh. She knew that I would take her to Mandalay. She knew I would never divorce her. I would never tell people all the terrible things she had told me." Maxim came up to me and held out his hands. "You hate me, don't you?" he said. "You can't understand me, can you?" I did not say anything. I held his hands against my heart. Only one thing mattered. Maxim did not love Rebecca. He had never loved her. Never, never. Maxim was talking again. "I thought about Mandalay too much," he said. "I put Mandalay first before anything else. I can't tell you about those terrible years with Rebecca, but she made Mandalay the place of beauty it is today, and I accepted everything because of Mandalay. Rebecca was careful at first," Maxim went on. "She had a flat in London. She met her friends there. Then she began to grow careless. She invited friends down here to Mandalay. I warned her. I told her that Mandalay was mine. Rebecca did not say anything. She only smiled. Then Frank came to me and told me he wanted to leave. He wouldn't say why at first, but I got the truth from him in the end. Rebecca never left him alone. She was always going to his house and asking him to her cottage. Rebecca went up to London for a time. When she came back, she took Giles out sailing with her. I knew what had happened as soon as they came back. Beatrice and Giles never stayed at Mandalay again. After that, I knew I could never trust Rebecca with anyone. She had a cousin, an awful man, called Jack Favell. He started to come here when I was away. "I've met him," I said. "He came here the day you went to London. I didn't tell you. I didn't want to remind you of Rebecca."
"Remind me?" said Maxim. "Oh, God, I never needed to be reminded. Favell often stayed with Rebecca down at the cottage. He is a bad man. He's been in trouble with the police many times. I told Rebecca that I would shoot Favell if he came to Mandalay again. Then one night I could stand our life here no longer. Rebecca came back from London very late. She went to the cottage. I thought Favell was with her. I went after them. I took a gun to frighten him."
Maxim was talking in quick, short sentences. I held his hand tightly.
"I saw a light in the cottage and went in. To my surprise, Rebecca was alone. She looked ill and strange. 'This is the end,' I told her. 'I can't stand any more.' Rebecca looked at me and smiled. 'It won't be easy to divorce me,' she said. 'Everyone believes our marriage is perfect.' Then she stood up and walked towards me. 'If I had a child, Max,' she said, 'everyone would think it was yours. You would like a son, wouldn't you? A boy to grow up at Mandalay, and you would never know who his father was.' And she smiled at me again. She was smiling when I killed her. The bullet went through her heart."
Maxim's voice was very low. He spoke slowly.
"There was blood all over the floor. I had to get water from the sea to clean the place. There was no moon and it was very dark," Maxim went on. "I carried Rebecca's body to the boat. I laid the body on the floor of the cabin. Then I took the boat out into the bay. I wanted to take the boat a good way out, but the wind was too strong for me. I made some holes in the wooden planks with a metal spike. I opened the sea cocks and the sea water flowed in. In a few minutes it had covered my feet. I shut the cabin door behind me, climbed into the dinghy and rowed back. Rebecca's boat was already sinking. I sat and watched it go down."
Maxim looked at me.
"That's all," he said. "There's no more to tell."
The library was very quiet. We sat there together for some minutes without saying anything. Then Maxim began to speak again.
"I knew the boat would be found one day," he said. "Rebecca knew she would win in the end. I saw her smile when she died."
"But Rebecca is dead," I told him. "That's what we must remember."
"The diver has seen the body. They're going to get the boat up tomorrow morning. They'll find out that it's Rebecca's body in the cabin."
"Then you must say you made a mistake about the other body. Nobody saw you that night. We are the only two people who know what happened that night, Maxim."
"Yes," he said. "Yes, I suppose so."
"They will think the boat sank when Rebecca went down into the cabin. They'll think she was trapped there. They'll think that, won't they, Maxim?" I said.
"I don't know," Maxim replied slowly. "I don't know."
At that moment, the telephone in the next room began to ring. Chapter 19. Colonel Julian. Maxim went into the little room and closed the door. I sat there listening to the sound of Maxim's voice. I was no longer afraid of Rebecca. I did not hate her any more. Maxim and I were going to fight this together. Rebecca had not won. She had lost.
"That was Colonel Julian," said Maxim as he came back into the room. "He's the local magistrate. He has to be there when they get the boat up tomorrow. He asked me if I had made a mistake about the other body."
The telephone began to ring again. Maxim answered it quickly and came back into the library.
"It's begun," he said.
"What do you mean?" I asked.
"That was a reporter. The whole thing will be in the papers tomorrow. There's nothing we can do."
After dinner, we went back into the library as usual. I sat at Maxim's feet, my head against his knees. In a strange way, we were completely happy. Rain fell in the night. When I woke up in the morning, Maxim had already gone out. I went down to breakfast as usual. There were a lot of letters thanking us for the ball. How far away that seemed. I felt calmer, much older now. I took the letters into the morning room. To my surprise, the room was dusty and untidy. The windows were tightly closed, and some of the flowers were dead. I rang the bell for a maid, and when she came, I spoke to her angrily. I wondered why I had been frightened of the servants before. The menu for the day lay on the desk. It was the same food as the day before. I crossed everything out and rang for Robert. "Tell Mrs. Danvers to order something different," I told him. Then I went out into the garden and cut some roses. Very soon Maxim will be back, I thought. I must be calm and quiet. I took the roses back into the morning room. It was clean and tidy now. As I began to arrange the flowers, there was a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Danvers, holding the menu in her hand. She looked pale and tired. "I don't understand," she said. "I am not used to having messages sent by Robert. When Mrs. De Winter wanted any change in the menu, she spoke to me herself." "I am Mrs. De Winter now, Mrs. Danvers," I said, "and I shall do things in my own way." Mrs. Danvers stared at me. "Is it true," she asked slowly, "that Mrs. De Winter's boat has been found, and that there was a body in the cabin?" "I'm afraid I don't know anything about that," I said. "Don't you?" Mrs. Danvers said. She stood looking at me. I turned away. "I will give orders about the lunch," she said. She waited, but I did not say anything. She went out of the room. Mrs. Danvers did not frighten me any more. She was my enemy, and I did not care. But if she learnt the truth about Rebecca's death, she would become Maxim's enemy too. I suddenly felt sick and ill. I went out onto the terrace and began to walk up and down. At 11:30, Maxim phoned me from Frank's office. He told me he was bringing Colonel Julian and Frank back for lunch. The time dragged by. At 1:55, I heard the sound of a car in the drive. Maxim came into the hall with Frank and Colonel Julian. Colonel Julian, the magistrate, was a middle-aged man with a kind face and grey hair. "This is most unpleasant for you and your husband," Colonel Julian said to me. "I feel very sorry for both of you." Maxim and Frank went on into the dining room, and Colonel Julian continued to speak to me quietly. "We found a body in the boat this morning. It is the body of the late Mrs. De Winter. As you know, Mr. De Winter identified the other body found in the sea as his wife. That makes things rather difficult for us now." The Colonel stopped suddenly as Maxim came back into the hall. "Lunch is ready. Shall we go in?" he said. I did not look at Maxim during lunch. We talked about the weather, and Colonel Julian asked me about my life in France. Frith and Robert were in the room, and no one wanted to talk about the boat. At last Frith served coffee, and the servants left us. "I wish an inquest wasn't necessary," Colonel Julian said, "but I'm afraid it is. I don't think it will take very long. De Winter will have to say that the body in the boat was the late Mrs. De Winter. Then the boat builder will say that the boat was in good order when he last saw it. This must be done." "That's quite all right," Maxim said. "We understand." "I suppose Mrs. De Winter had to go down into the cabin for something. Then the door shut, and somehow she was trapped there. Don't you think so, Crawley?" the Colonel asked Frank. "Oh, yes, of course," said Frank. I had a sudden feeling that Frank knew the truth. "The inquest will be on Tuesday afternoon," Colonel Julian told us. "We'll keep it as short as possible, but I'm afraid the reporters will be there." There was another silence. "Shall we go into the garden?" I said. We all stood on the terrace for a moment, and then Colonel Julian looked at his watch. "Thank you for the lunch," he said to me. "I'm afraid I must leave now. Would you like a lift, Crawley?" Maxim walked with them to the car. When they had gone, he came back to me on the terrace.
"It's going to be all right," Maxim said. "There won't be any trouble at the inquest. There's nothing to show what I did. Colonel Julian thinks she was trapped in the cabin, and the jury will think that too."
I said nothing.
"It's you I'm sorry for," Maxim told me sadly. "I don't care about anything else. I'm glad that I killed Rebecca. But I can't forget what this has done to you. You've lost that young, sweet look, and it will never come back. In 24 hours you have grown so much older."
Frith brought in the newspapers at breakfast the following day. The story was in all of them. There was a picture of Mandalay and an awful one of Maxim. All the papers said that Rebecca's body had been found after the fancy dress ball. They said how everyone had loved Rebecca. They all said that Maxim had married his young second wife within a year of Rebecca's death. It all made a good story. Maxim's face went whiter and whiter. I wondered what the papers would say if they knew the truth. That terrible word, murder, would be on every front page. Frank was a great help to us. We had no more phone calls from reporters and no visitors. It was just a question of waiting until Tuesday. Maxim and I stayed quietly in the house or in the gardens. We did not walk in the woods or go down to the sea. The weather was very hot and the air was heavy. There were clouds, but the rain did not fall. Chapter 20. The Inquest. Tuesday came at last. The inquest was at 2:00. After an early lunch, I drove into the town with Maxim. "I think I shall stay here in the car," I said. "I won't come in with you after all."
"I didn't want you to come," Maxim said. "I wish you had stayed at Mandalay."
Maxim went off and left me sitting there. The minutes went by. I wondered what was happening at the inquest. I got out of the car and began walking up and down. A policeman looked at me.
"Excuse me, madam," he said. "Aren't you Mrs. De Winter? You can wait inside if you like."
The policeman took me into an empty room. 5 minutes passed, nothing happened. I got up and walked out of the little room. The policeman was still standing there. "How long will they be?" I asked him.
"I'll go and see if you like," the policeman said.
He was back again in a moment.
"It won't last much longer," he told me. "Mr. De Winter has just finished giving his evidence. There's only the boat builder, Mr. Tabb, to speak now. Would you like to go in? There's an empty seat near the door."
I followed the policeman. He opened the door for me and I went in quietly and sat down. The room was small and full of people. The air was hot and stuffy. Frank was sitting next to Maxim. To my surprise, Mrs. Danvers was there too, with Favell beside her. I wondered whether Maxim had seen him. Tabb, the boat builder, standing in the centre of the room, was answering the coroner's questions.
"Was the boat in good condition?" the coroner was asking.
"Oh, yes, it certainly was the last time I saw it,"
Tabb said.
"It was a strong little boat. I can't understand why it sank that night."
"Accidents have happened before," the coroner said.
"Mrs. De Winter was careless for a moment and she died." "Excuse me, sir," said the boat builder. "I would like to say something else."
"Very well. Go on," said the coroner.
"It's this, sir. There was nothing wrong with that boat when I last saw it, so what I want to know is this. Who made those holes in the planks? Rocks didn't do it.
The boat sank too far away from them, and those holes were made with something sharp."
I could not look at anyone. I stared down at the floor. For a moment the coroner was too surprised to speak. Then he said,
"What do you mean? What sort of holes?"
"There were 3 of them, in different parts of the boat. And that's not all. The seacocks had been turned full on.
The seacocks, what are they? Asked the coroner.
Well, the seacocks close the pipes leading to the wash basins, sir. They must be kept tightly closed when the boat is sailing, otherwise the sea water comes in.
It was hot in that crowded room, far too hot. I wished someone would open a window. The boat builder was speaking again.
With those holes, sir, and the seacocks open, a small boat like Mrs. de Winter's would soon sink. It's my opinion that there was no accident. That boat was sunk on purpose.
I must try and get out of the door, I thought. There was no air. People were standing up and talking loudly. I heard the coroner say,
"Mr. de Winter."
Maxim was standing up. I could not look at him.
"Mr. de Winter," the coroner said, "you have heard James Tabb's evidence. Do you know anything about those holes?"
Nothing.
Can you think why they are there?
No, of course not. This news is a shock to you, of course.
Of course it is a shock. Does it surprise you that I am shocked?
Maxim's voice was hard and angry. Oh, God, I thought. Don't let Maxim lose his temper. The coroner was speaking again.
"Mr. de Winter, I want to find out exactly how your late wife died. Who looked after Mrs. de Winter's boat?"
She looked after it herself.
"Then whoever took the boat out that night also made those holes and opened the seacocks."
"I suppose so."
"You have told us that the door and windows of the cabin were shut."
"Yes."
"Doesn't this seem very strange to you, Mr. de Winter?"
"Yes, it does."
"Mr. de Winter, I'm afraid I must ask you one other question. Were you and the late Mrs. de Winter happily married?"
It was hot, so hot. I tried to stand up, but I could not. The ground came up to meet me, and then I heard Maxim's voice, clear and strong.
"Will someone take my wife outside? She's going to faint."
I was sitting in the little room again. Frank was beside me. "I'm sorry," I said. "It was so hot in there."
"Are you feeling better, Mrs. de Winter?" Frank asked. "Maxim has told me to take you back to Mandalay."
Frank helped me to get up. "I'd much rather stay," I said. "I want to wait for Maxim."
"Maxim may be some time," Frank told me. "They may have to go over the evidence again."
"But what are they trying to find out?" Frank did not answer. We were in his car now, and he was driving very fast. "Did you see Favell there?" I asked. "He was sitting with Mrs. Danvers." "I don't trust them, Frank. They might make trouble." Frank did not answer. He could not know how much Maxim had told me. Then we were back at Mandalay.
"Will you be all right now?" Frank asked me. "I should go back. Maxim may want me."
He got quickly back into the car again and drove away. I went upstairs to my room and lay down on my bed. What were they all saying now? What was happening? What would I do if Frank came back to Mandalay without Maxim? I thought again of that dreadful word, murder. God, let me not think about it. Let me think about something else, anything. I must have fallen asleep. I woke up suddenly. It was 5 o'clock. I got up and went to the window. There was no wind. Lightning flashed against the grey sky. I heard thunder in the distance. A few drops of rain began to fall. I went downstairs and sat with Jasper in the library. Chapter 21. A Visit from Jack Favell. It was after 6 when I heard the sound of Maxim's car. I tried to stand up, but my legs were so weak that I had to lean against a chair. Maxim came into the room and stood by the door. He looked tired and old.
"It's all over," he said.
I waited. I could not speak or walk towards him.
"Suicide," Maxim said. "That's the verdict. They said that Rebecca killed herself."
I sat down. "Suicide," I repeated. "Why do they think Rebecca did that?"
"God knows," Maxim said.
He went and stood by the window.
"There's one more thing to be done. Rebecca's body has to be buried. I'm going down to the church now. We'll talk about everything when I get back. We've got to start our lives all over again. The past can't hurt us if we're together. We'll have children too, I promise you. I must go now. I'm meeting Frank and Colonel Julian at the church."
He left the room quickly, and then I heard the sound of his car driving away. It was quiet in the library. I thought about the church where Rebecca was being buried at last. Just before 7, the rain began to fall heavily. I opened the windows to let in the cold, clean air. The rain was falling so heavily that I did not hear Frith come in.
"Excuse me, madam," he said. "There's a gentleman to see Mr. De Winter. It's Mr. Favell."
I was very surprised. "I think I had better see Mr. Favell," I said. "Bring him in here, please, Frith." I hoped that Favell would go before Maxim came back. I could not think why Favell had come. "I'm afraid Maxim is not here," I said, when Favell walked into the room. His eyes were red. I wondered if he had been drinking.
"I don't mind waiting," Favell replied. "Max will be back for dinner, I'm sure."
"Mr. Favell," I said, "I don't want to be rude, but I am very tired. It will be better if you come back in the morning."
No, he said, coming towards me. "I've got something to say to Max. This has been a shock to me, you know. I was very fond of Rebecca."
"Yes, of course," I said. "I'm very sorry for you."
"I was fonder of Rebecca than of anyone else in the world," Favell went on, "and she was fond of me. That's why I've come here to find out the truth. Suicide. My God. You and I know it wasn't suicide, don't we?"
As Favell was speaking, the door opened and Maxim and Frank came in.
"What the hell are you doing here?" Maxim said to Favell.
"Why, hello, Max, old man," Favell said. "You must be feeling very pleased with yourself."
"Do you mind leaving the house?" said Maxim coldly. "I don't want you here."
"Now, wait a minute, Max," Favell answered. "You've been very lucky, but I can still make life unpleasant for you, and dangerous too, perhaps."
Maxim stared hard at Favell.
"Oh, yes?" he said. "In what way can you make things dangerous?"
"I'll tell you, Max," said Favell with an unpleasant smile. "You know all about Rebecca and me. Her death was a great shock. Then I read about Rebecca's boat and the body in the cabin. So I went to the inquest. I heard the boat builder's evidence. What about those holes in the boat, Max?"
"You heard the verdict?" Maxim told him. "I have nothing more to say."
Favell laughed.
"You know Rebecca didn't kill herself. I have a note here that may interest you. I kept it because it was the last thing Rebecca ever wrote to me. Listen."
Favell took a piece of paper from his pocket. I recognized Rebecca's hard black writing.
"I tried to phone you," Favell read, "but you were out. I'm leaving London now and going back to Mandalay. I'll wait for you in the cottage. Come down as soon as you can. I've got something to tell you."
Favell put the note back in his pocket.
"I found that in my London flat. It was too late to drive down to Mandalay. When I phoned the following day, Rebecca was dead. Do you really think Rebecca killed herself after writing that note?"
Maxim said nothing.
"Now, Max, old man," Favell said at last. "You know I'm not a rich man. If I had £2,000 or £3,000, I could live quite well. I'd never come back, I promise you.
I've already asked you to leave the house, Maxim said. The door is behind you.
Favell laughed again.
Think again, Max, said Favell. I don't suppose your new bride wants to be known as the wife of a murderer.
You can't frighten me, Favell, Maxim answered. Shall I phone Colonel Julian? You can tell your story to him.
You wouldn't dare, Max, said Favell. I have enough evidence to hang you, Max.
Maxim walked slowly towards the telephone in the next room. Stop him, I said to Frank. Stop him, for God's sake! But it was too late. Maxim was already speaking.
Is that Colonel Julian? It's De Winter here. Could you come over to Mandalay at once? No, I can't say anything over the phone. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Maxim came back again into the room.
Colonel Julian will be here in 10 minutes, he said.
We waited in silence. The rain was so heavy that we did not hear the sound of the car. We were taken by surprise when Frith brought the magistrate into the library.
Good evening, Colonel Julian, Maxim said at once. This is Jack Favell, my late wife's cousin. He has something to say to you.
Favell went up to Colonel Julian.
I'm not happy about the verdict. I want you to read this note. Tell me whether you think the writer had decided to kill herself.
Colonel Julian took the note and read it slowly.
I see what you mean, he said.
But the note is not clear.
What do you think really happened to Mrs. De Winter?
Favell looked at Maxim.
I'll tell you what I think, he said slowly. Rebecca never opened those seacocks. She didn't make those holes in the boat. Rebecca didn't kill herself. I say she was murdered. Do you want to know who the murderer is? He's there, standing by the window. Mr. Maximilian De Winter. He's your murderer. Take a good look at him.
Favell began to laugh, a high, stupid laugh, as he twisted the note round and round in his fingers. Chapter 22. Rebecca's Diary. Thank God for Favell's laugh. I saw a look of disgust come into Colonel Julian's face.
The man's drunk, he said quickly. He doesn't know what he's saying.
Drunk, am I?
Shouted Favell.
Oh, no, I'm not drunk. Max De Winter murdered Rebecca, and I'm going to prove it.
Wait a minute, said Colonel Julian. I want to hear your proof.
Proof?
Said Favell.
Aren't those holes in the boat enough proof for you?
Certainly not, said Colonel Julian. Unless you can find someone who saw him do it.
I'll get your proof for you, shouted Favell. De Winter killed Rebecca because of me. He was jealous because she loved me. He went down to the cottage and killed her there. Wait a minute. I think I can find someone who saw him.
I suddenly knew what Favell meant. Someone had seen it all happen. Someone who was often down there in the bay. Ben.
There's an idiot who's always around the cottage, Favell said. He often slept on the beach. I'm sure he saw everything.
Can we get this man and question him? Asked Colonel Julian.
Of course, said Maxim. His name is Ben.
Could you go and get him, Frank? Take your car.
Frank went out quickly. Favell laughed angrily. His face was very red.
You all help each other down here, don't you? He said. Crawley knows the truth, I'm sure. He'll be there to hold the young bride's arm when Max is sentenced to death.
Without warning, Maxim went up to Favell and hit him hard. Favell fell heavily to the floor. I wished that Maxim had not hit him. Favell got slowly to his feet, walked over to a small table and poured himself some whiskey. I saw Colonel Julian look thoughtfully at Maxim. Was he beginning to believe Favell's story? The door opened and Frank came in.
"All right, Ben," he said quietly. "Don't be frightened."
Ben stepped into the room and stared at everyone with his small eyes. Favell walked up to him.
"You know who I am, don't you?" he said.
Ben did not answer.
"Come on," said Favell. "You've seen me in the cottage, haven't you?"
Ben held Frank's arm. "I've never seen him," he said. "Is he going to take me away?"
"No, of course not," said Colonel Julian. "Now listen to me, Ben. You remember the lady with the boat? Were you on the beach when she took her boat out for the last time?" "You were there, weren't you?" said Favell, standing over Ben. "You saw Mrs. De Winter go into the cottage, and Mr. De Winter too. What happened then?"
Ben shook his head and moved back against the wall. "I didn't see anything," he said. He began to cry.
"You damn little idiot,"
Favell said slowly. "I think Ben can go home now, don't you, Colonel Julian?" Maxim said. Frank took Ben out of the room as the colonel nodded his head.
"That poor fellow was terrified," he said. "He's no use to you, Favell. I'm afraid you can't prove your story."
Favell did not answer. Instead, he rang the bell, and when Frith came in, he said,
"Ask Mrs. Danvers to come here, Frith." "Isn't Mrs. Danvers the housekeeper?" asked Colonel Julian as Frith left the room. "She was also Rebecca's friend. She knew her for years," Favell said with his unpleasant smile.
We all waited, watching the door. Then Mrs. Danvers came in and shut the door behind her.
"Good evening, Mrs. Danvers," Colonel Julian said. "I would like to ask you a question. You knew the late Mrs. De Winter well. Mr. Favell has told us that Mrs. De Winter was in love with him. Is that true?"
"No, it is not," Mrs. Danvers answered.
"Now listen, Danny,"
Favell began to shout, but Mrs. Danvers took no notice.
"She was not in love with you, Mr. Jack, or with Mr. De Winter. She was not in love with anyone. She thought men were fools. She amused herself with you, that was all."
Maxim went very white. Favell stared at Mrs. Danvers, as though he did not understand her.
"Mrs. Danvers," Colonel Julian said quietly, "can you think of any reason why Mrs. De Winter killed herself?"
Mrs. Danvers shook her head.
"No, certainly not," she said. "There you are! What did I tell you?" Favell shouted. "Be quiet, will you? Let Mrs. Danvers read the note. She may understand it," Colonel Julian said.
Mrs. Danvers took the note, read it, and then shook her head again.
"I don't know what she meant. If it was something important, she would have told me. Can you tell us how Mrs. De Winter spent that last day in London? Did she keep a diary?" asked Colonel Julian.
"I've got her diary in my room," Mrs. Danvers replied. "I kept all her things. I'll go and get it."
"Well, De Winter," said Colonel Julian, "do you mind us seeing this diary?"
"Of course not," said Maxim. Once again, I saw Colonel Julian give Maxim a hard look. This time Frank saw it too. Somehow I felt sure that the truth was in that diary. Mrs. Danvers came back with a small book in her hand.
"Here is the page for the day Mrs. De Winter died," she said.
Colonel Julian looked at it carefully.
"Yes," he said. "Here it is. Hairdressers at 12 o'clock. Then lunch, and then Baker, 2 o'clock. Who was Baker?"
He looked at Maxim. Maxim shook his head.
"Baker," repeated Mrs. Danvers. "She knew no one called Baker." "We must find out who this person was," said Colonel Julian. "If he wasn't a friend, perhaps it was someone she was afraid of." "Mrs. De Winter afraid?" said Mrs. Danvers. She was afraid of nothing and no one. Only one thing worried her. That was the thought of illness, of dying slowly in her bed. "What does all this matter?" said Favell. "If Baker was important, Danny would know about him." Mrs. Danvers was turning the pages of the diary. "There's a telephone number here at the back," she said, "and the name Baker again." "Well," said Maxim, lighting a cigarette, "perhaps someone should phone that number. Would you mind, Frank?" Frank took the diary without a word and went into the next room. He shut the door behind him. When he came back, he said, "That was a doctor's number. Dr. Baker used to live there, but he left 6 months ago. They gave me his new address. I have written it here." And Frank held out a piece of paper. It was then that Maxim looked at me. He looked at me like a man saying goodbye for the last time. That piece of paper was enough to hang Maxim. I knew why Rebecca had gone to a doctor. I knew what she had wanted to tell Favell. Rebecca had been pregnant when she died. She had been going to have a child. It was the one clear proof that Rebecca had not killed herself. I was sure that this was the truth. I knew Maxim thought so too. "Well done, Frank," said Maxim calmly. "Where does the doctor live now?" "In North London," Frank replied. "But he's not on the phone. He's a very well-known women's doctor." "Well," said Colonel Julian, "there must have been something wrong with her after all." "I'll write him a letter," Frank said. "I don't think he would tell you anything," Colonel Julian answered. "I think De Winter should see him and explain." "I'm ready to go," said Maxim quietly. "Shall I go up in the morning?" "He's not going alone," Favell said with a laugh. "You go with him, Julian, and I think I'd better go too. What time do we start?" Colonel Julian looked at Maxim. 9 o'clock, he said. "Perhaps you will take me in your car." "We'll meet at the crossroads just after 9, Favell said. He walked to the door. "I suppose you're not going to ask me to dinner, so I'll say goodbye. Come on, Danny. I'll see you in the morning, Max." Colonel Julian came up to me and took my hand. "Good night," he said. "Get your husband to bed early. Tomorrow will be a long day." He held my hand for a moment, but he did not look into my eyes. He and Frank went out together. Maxim and I were alone at last. "I'm coming with you tomorrow," I said. "Yes," Maxim answered. "We must be together as long as we can." I put my arms around him and held him. We did not say anything. Then Maxim held me tightly. We began to kiss each other, like guilty lovers who had never kissed before. Chapter 23. Dr. Baker. I woke up early the following morning at about 6 o'clock. I got up and went to the window. The trees were covered in mist. There was a sharp coolness in the air. Autumn had arrived. This was the start of a new day at Mandalay. Soon the servants would be starting work. Whatever happened to us, life at Mandalay would go on. The peace of Mandalay could not be broken. Its beauty could not be destroyed. The flowers would come every year, the birds would sing. Mandalay would always be here, safe and secure within the sound of the sea. Maxim slept on, and I did not wake him. The day ahead would be long and tiring. London was many miles away. We did not know what we should find at the end of the journey. Somewhere in London lived a man called Baker. He had never heard of us, but our future was in his hands. I had a bath, dressed, and then woke Maxim. He got up and went into the bathroom. I began to pack a few things. We might have to stay overnight in London.
I looked at my small case. It seemed so long since I had used it. But it was only 4 months. I could not believe it. We had breakfast together and I went out onto the terrace. The air was fresh and clear now. It was going to be a perfect day. At 9 o'clock exactly, Frank brought up Colonel Julian in his car. We were going in Maxim's car. I sat beside Maxim and Colonel Julian got into the back. "You will telephone, won't you?" Frank said as he stood on the steps. "Yes, of course," Maxim said. As we drove away, I looked back at the house. It had never looked more beautiful. For some reason, my eyes filled with tears. Then we were round the bend of the drive, and I could see the house no longer. When we came to the crossroads, Favell was already waiting. He waved when he saw us and started up his car. I settled down for the long journey to London. The hours passed and the miles went by, Favell's car always behind us. We had lunch somewhere and reached London at about 3 o'clock. It was then that I began to feel tired. It was warm and the streets were busy. The drive through the centre of London seemed very long. Maxim looked pale and tired, but he did not say anything. Favell's car was always behind us. We reached Baker's house at about 5 o'clock. Maxim stopped the car and we got out. Favell came up to meet us. We all walked slowly up the path to the front door. Colonel Julian rang the bell. A woman opened the door. "Is Dr. Baker at home?" said Colonel Julian. "He is expecting us. I sent a telegram." "Yes, of course," said the woman. "My husband is in the garden. I'll tell him you're here." She took us into a cool room at the back of the house. She went out, and in a few minutes a tall man came into the room. "I'm Dr. Baker. I'm sorry to keep you waiting. Please sit down," he said. "We are sorry to trouble you, Dr. Baker," Colonel Julian said. "My name is Julian. This is Mr. De Winter, Mrs. De Winter, and Mr. Favell. We have come about the death of the late Mrs. De Winter. You may have read the report in the papers." "The verdict was suicide," Favell said. "I knew Mrs. De Winter very well. She did not kill herself. She had no reason to. We want to know why she came to see you on the day she died." Dr. Baker looked surprised. "I think you've made a mistake," he said. "No one called De Winter has ever come to me." "But we found your old telephone number in Mrs. De Winter's diary." Dr. Baker looked at the page from the diary that Colonel Julian was holding out to him. "That certainly was my number," he said. "Perhaps Mrs. De Winter gave you a different name," Colonel Julian suggested. "It's possible," said Dr. Baker slowly. "If you have any record of a visit on that day, could we see it?" Colonel Julian asked. "This is an important matter." "Murder," Favell said. "Of course," said the doctor. "I had no idea there was any question of that. I'll go and get my book." While Dr. Baker was out of the room, we said nothing. No one looked at anyone else. Favell whistled quietly under his breath. Dr. Baker came back into the room with a large book. He opened the book and turned the pages. We all stood watching his face. "I saw a Mrs. Danvers on the 12th at 2 o'clock, Dr. Baker said at last. "Danny? Why did—" Favell began. Maxim broke in. "Rebecca gave the wrong name, of course," he said. "Do you remember the visit now, Doctor?" But Dr. Baker was already searching his files. He picked out a card and read it. "Yes," he said slowly. "I remember now." "Was she tall and dark, a beautiful woman?" Colonel Julian asked. "Yes," said Dr. Baker. He put back the card and looked at Maxim. The doctor spoke slowly. "The woman who called herself Mrs. Danvers was very ill indeed. She had come to me the week before. I took some x-rays. She had come back to hear the result. I remember her words exactly.
I want to know the truth, she said. If I'm really ill, I want to know. So I told her.
Dr. Baker stopped and looked down at the files.
There was nothing to be done, he went on. An operation would have been useless. I told her that. In 6 months, she would have been dead.
No one said a word, and the doctor went on.
Mrs. De Winter looked a healthy woman. She had very little pain at that time, but the pain would have come. The X-rays showed that she could never have had a child, but that was nothing to do with her illness.
Everyone was standing up. We shook hands with Dr. Baker, and he walked with us to the front door.
"Shall I send you my report?" Dr. Baker asked. "We may not need it," said Colonel Julian. "We'll write to you if we do. Thank you very much."
"I am glad to have been of some use," said Dr. Baker.
"Goodbye."
And he shut the door. Chapter 24. The Return to Mandalay. We went and stood by the car. No one said anything for a few minutes. Favell's face was grey. His hand shook as he lit a cigarette.
"She kept it a secret from everyone, even Danny. It's been a dreadful shock to me," Favell said. "You're all right, of course, Max. You've been lucky, haven't you? You and your young wife can go back to Mandalay now. You think you've won, but don't be too sure. I haven't finished with you yet."
"Shall we get into the car and go?" Colonel Julian asked Maxim.
Favell smiled unpleasantly. As we drove away, he was still standing there, watching us.
"Favell can't do anything," Colonel Julian told us. "I'll soon deal with him if he comes near Mandalay again. I don't think the papers will bother you any more. There may be some talk, but I'll make sure that people hear about Dr. Baker."
"Thank you very much," Maxim said.
"What a dreadful thing illness is," Colonel Julian went on. "I suppose she could not face the pain. She was such a lovely young woman, too."
Neither of us answered him. Colonel Julian's sister lived in London, and he asked Maxim to take him to her house.
"We must thank you for all your help," Maxim said as the magistrate got out of the car.
"I've been glad to help. You must forget it all now. Why don't you have a holiday? Go abroad, perhaps. Goodbye, both of you. It's been a long day."
As Maxim started up the car, I leant back in my seat and closed my eyes. We drove on through the traffic, and I felt full of peace. Nothing could hurt us any more. We had dinner in a restaurant, and Maxim phoned Frank. "Do you think Colonel Julian knows the truth about Rebecca's death?" I asked Maxim as we were drinking our coffee.
"Of course he knows," Maxim said. "But he will never say anything. I believe that Rebecca lied to me on purpose. She wanted me to kill her. That's why she laughed. She was laughing when she died."
I did not say anything. It was all over. There was no need for Maxim to look so white and troubled.
"I'm not sure that Rebecca hasn't won even now," Maxim went on. "Frank told me something rather strange on the phone. Mrs. Danvers has left Mandalay. There was a long-distance call for her at 6. By 6:45, she had gone."
"Isn't that a good thing?" I said. "Favell phoned her, of course, but they can't do anything to us." I was glad that Mrs. Danvers had gone. Mandalay could be ours. We would have people to stay, and soon, very soon, Maxim and I would have children.
"Have you finished your coffee?"
Maxim said to me suddenly.
"I feel that we must get back to Mandalay as soon as possible. Something's wrong. I know it is."
"But you'll be so tired," I said.
"No, I shall be all right. We can be at Mandalay by 2:00.
We went out to the car and Maxim covered me with a rug. It was dark now and I fell asleep almost at once. I started to dream. I saw the staircase at Mandalay and Mrs. Danvers standing there in her long black dress. Then, in my dream, I was alone in the woods near Mandalay. I wanted to get to the Happy Valley, but I could not find it. The dark trees were all around me. Then I was standing on the terrace. Moonlight shone on the windows. The gardens had gone, and the dark woods came up to the walls of the house. I woke up suddenly.
"You've slept for 2 hours," Maxim told me. "It's 2:15. We shall be home by 3.
The early morning was very cold. The sky was dark now, and there were no stars. "What time did you say it was?" I said suddenly.
"It's 2:20, Maxim replied.
"That's strange," I said. "The dawn seems to be coming up over there behind those hills. But it can't be. It's too early."
"It's the wrong direction, too," Maxim said. "You're looking west."
I went on watching the sky. It was still getting lighter. A blood-red light was spreading across the sky. Maxim began to drive faster, much faster.
"That's not the dawn," he said. "That's Mandalay."
We reached the top of the hill. The road to Mandalay lay before us. There was no moon, and the sky above our heads was black. But the sky in front of us was full of dreadful light. And the light was red, red like blood. The wind blew towards us from the sea. The wind smelt of smoke, and it was grey with ashes. They were the ashes of Mandalay.